Open Your Heart of Wild Honey, Occult Medievalism, and Leonora Carrington's The Hearing Trumpet. In the past decade or so, Leonora Carrington's artwork has had an explosion of interest, including even having one of the Venice Biennale 3 years ago themed on one of her books, in fact, a book of children's stories. But her literature has not had the same kind of explosion, and so I guess I'm lighting a fuse as much as possible, and as often as possible, too, because I think her writing is absolutely magnificent as well, and includes a lot of the same themes and interests and ideas that are in her paintings, but also some very different things. Also, it helps that she is incredibly funny with a real black sense of humor, and brings together, as we will see in a moment, many different themes together in her work. And so, of course, today I'm focusing on The Hearing Trumpet, her novel, and she has written, in addition to that, many short stories, another novel, between a novella novel, The Stone Door, and a novella, Little Francis, as well as a bunch of plays. And the plays are really wild. It's bad enough. I've had to learn French in recent years, and reading surrealism in French is not something I recommend. And reading surrealist plays in French, even less of a recommend. But her plays are coming out this summer in an English edition, so I'm hoping this will add to the interest in her work. So Leonora Carrington has a fascinating life story, but I'm not going to take time to talk about it today, because then I would never get around to anything else. But 1917 to 2011, just so we have a time frame. And if you are interested in her more, I would certainly point you to Susan Eber's study, Surrealism, Alchemy, and Art, which looks at her work in context of her particular biography, but also in her studies into esoteric items and esoteric themes of many diverse kinds. If you're interested in probably this central traumatic event of her life, I would also recommend Marion Bryan Talbot's Armed with Madness, which covers the period of her life from when she was an artist in Paris and had an affair with Max Ernst until, of course, the coming of World War II, where he was locked in a concentration camp, and she tried to flee with friends to Spain, where she had a mental breakdown and was incarcerated in a mental hospital, and there's a lot of that before finally escaping to Portugal, New York, and then finally Mexico City, where she spent most of the rest of her life. And you can also read her own account of that time, which was originally recorded in French and then translated in English, and it's been re-released a few times. But again, it's a story of how her esoteric studies were fundamental to her understanding her own mental breakdown and recovering from it. And so she sees it very much through that kind of lens. And it's a really compelling book as a kind of memoir too, in this whole area of, the many stories of women and madness, because of course we live in a world that drives us crazy. Okay, but The Hearing Trumpet, this novel, which tells the story of Marion Leatherby, who is 92 years old, has a little bit of a beard, can see pretty well but cannot hear very well, obviously, which is why her friend Carmela gives her the hearing trumpet, and the life that she thought was so wonderful and everything was cool and calm in her home. She finds out that her son and his wife call her a dribbling bag of old bones, and their intention is to send her away to an old folks' home and disrupt her life completely. So she's not very happy to hear about this. This was written in the 1950s when Leonora Carrington was a young mother in her 30s and not published until 1974. In fact, it wasn't published in English until a couple years after that, too. But there is so much in this book that I'm not going to cover because of the limits of time. And some of what I will cover will still make it sound like incredibly mad. Some of the things you should know is that she used people that she was close to in writing the story and sort of stole some of the characteristics of them. Most notably, her very good friend Remedios Varo, who has a similar kind of trajectory. She, of course, was born instead in Spain and came to Paris to be with the other artists in that time period, escaped the war, she went directly to Mexico. And they were very close friends. She and Leonora and the photographer Katie Horna were called by their friends Las Tres Brujas, the three witches, because of their interest in the occult and also their kind of mischievous ideas around cooking, too. Serving tapioca with squid ink and calling it caviar, and trying to see if they could fool people. But a very close relationship, a great deal of fun and art that was worked between their before the sudden and unfortunate very early death of Remedios Varo, another artist whose work is now beginning to get the attention that it really deserves. There was a huge exhibition in Chicago last year or the year before. But again, another one of these artists who, people used to teach the surrealists as just the men, whereas all the surrealist women are absolutely amazing and interesting. One of the first collectors of Carrington's work, and Varo's to that extent too, was Edward James, who was an eccentric Englishman, art collector, and some other things. You probably might know him best from having collected things like the Lips couch that Dali created. He curated a lot of the work of the early surrealists. He was, born into money, so he was able to make some use of it. And he would come to Mexico and look at Leonora's paintings, buy them. It was a big part of the support for her, not just monetarily, although, that's very important. But he also really had faith in her and faith in her abilities. And in fact, he became so enamored of Mexico that he bought land there and built this very elaborate sort of hideaway in the jungle, and you can look on YouTube. There's a very nice documentary on him that you can visit this place, because Leonora went down there and helped decorate it and painting murals on the walls. So it's quite an amazing, and now open as a museum. So these two as characters in the book. There's also Gurdjieff, if you're familiar with the occult history of the 19th century. Gurdjieff is one of these big names, and there was a big Gurdjieff group in Mexico City that both Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington belonged to. Remedios Varo was a little more closely attached to it. Carrington, as you will see, is kind of a loose portrayal of it in the novel, had some reservations about the group. But Gurdjieff is part of this 19th century occult revival that was very much about the sort of one occult system for everything, and with very specific ways of controlling your behavior. There was a big thing about movements. The movements are very important. That becomes part of the book. But there's dancing, there's diet, there's all kinds of things. That again, there's sort of this system for enlightenment where you have to sort of attend to all this sort of bodily discipline as well. And the Well of Light Brotherhood, which is the retirement home that Marianne is sent to, is very much based on the Gurdjieff group and the sort of exercises that the elderly women are put through, very much based on Gurdjieff. Another thing that is a consistent theme throughout Carrington's life is her interest in fairy tales. Her mother was Irish. They spent a lot of time at her grandmother's home in Ireland. She had an Irish nanny as well. She was born into money, not into status. That was why she was turned into a debutante, which is probably her most famous story. But she has this long history of interest in the Celtic legends that she was told as a child. Some of the first art that we have from her as a teenager is her own development of kind of fairy tales and these fairy tale figures. And a lot of the themes that continue throughout her lifetime can be glimpsed in those early paintings. They're really quite fascinating. Bee goddesses, this comes from her reading of Robert Graves' The White Goddess, which is another one of these trying to, there's just one monomyth that really explains all these different goddesses are one, this sort of flattening. It was very, very popular in the late 19th century and continuing on into the 20th century. But she obviously learned a lot from this sort of historical knowledge about goddesses in different parts of the world that shows up in a lot of her stories, but also in her fiction as well. And the bee goddess plays a very big role in this story. These are all the things I'm not talking about, by the way. There's a lot of gender slippage within the story, not only with Marion with her beard, but also there's... she also loves murder mysteries, and there is a murder mystery within the story. And the person who dies, not to give too much away, is discovered to be a man and not a woman, as they have thought all along. So there's a lot of sort of playing with the idea of gender, which is somewhat attached to her connection to the indigenous Mexican idea of the Nahuatl, the idea that every person has a human animal and another animal that is, they're both sort of attached in there. So she often shows sort of hybrid characters that have both human and non-human aspects to them. And I'll get to that, like werewolves. There's werewolves in it too, but we won't get to that. Also the Kabbalah. There's a lot of occult knowledge that figures in the novel, but she has a particular interest in the Kabbalah. Her husband was the Jewish photographer Chiki Weiss, who escaped from Hungary during World War II. They have similar stories of trauma around the war. Her novel, The Stone Door, deals with the two of them and sort of this imagined meeting of them in a kind of liminal space when they were children. But from her association with him, she got very interested in Jewish mysticism and looked into it quite a bit and was very captivated by the Kabbalah, which shows up in a lot of her work as well. So what am I actually going to talk about 12 minutes in? Medieval magic. And medieval magic is a really important part of what she does. And I'm going to talk about some specific things, which kind of helps because I'm piggybacking on what Shannon was talking about. At the center of it is saints' lives. And saints' lives in the Middle Ages were not just the sort of imitatio Christi, showing a reflection of the life of Christ, but they were also meant to be encouragement. Saints were people you could call on, but they were also people you could emulate. And the idea of the saint's life as a kind of story to give you hope, to give you inspiration, very much like what we'd say maybe superhero comics are now. They're saying, I could be strong like Superman, or I can be strong like Santa Barbara. So there's the saints' lives. There's also, of course, as we now will recognize, the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail for Carrington is very much tied to Graves' writing in The White Goddess, which is the Grail is much older than Christianity, and the Grail represents a fundamental creative force that is associated in the novel, associated with the goddess Venus. And so it's acknowledging the medieval aspects of the Grail story, but it's also taking it in a slightly different direction. And the one other medieval thing, who also came up in Shannon's talk, is Taliesin, the Bard of Wales. And there's, as you alluded to a little bit, there's the poems that are attributed to Taliesin, most of which are praise poems for kings, because that's how Welsh poets made a living back in the early Middle Ages. The 14th century book of Taliesin is a little bit different, and it becomes stories about the bard Taliesin. Okay, how do we tie all of these disparate elements together? We do it with alchemy. And alchemy was really central to the imagination of Leonora Carrington, but also her working. Much of her painting, in fact, the majority of her painting, is done in egg tempera, because she saw that as an essential piece of alchemy, that it was really part of the creative process. And if you don't know egg tempera, you use the yolks of eggs and then add powdered pigment to it to mix your colors. So it's a very tactile process. And as someone who was kind of obsessed with cooking as a creative impulse, it also fed into that. But it's very much tied to her interest in alchemy. And again, if we think of the whole history of alchemy from the 12th century with Roger Bacon, where it's really much more of an attempt to do a sort of scientific work, the actual work of chemistry, to later, when we think about it, undergoing this sort of occult change where it becomes much more about the spiritual alchemy and this idea of transformation. And the idea of transformation really is a theme that runs through so much of Carrington's work. Now here we have the traditional stages of the alchemical work, which were originally, again, for changing metals into different substances, but quickly became a way of purifying the soul to reach the perfection that was available to you, or might be available to you. So starting with saints' lives. Within the novel, Doña Rosalinda Alvarez Cruz de la Cueva, of the Cave, is the abbess of the convent of Santa Barbara of Tartarus, not the traditional location of Santa Barbara, but the saint's life as imitatio Christi. Here it is a much more radical interpretation of a saint's life, and a saint that we would recognize as kind of unconventional, to say the least. The Vita is written down by a priest who, it's noted in another hand at the end of the Vita that he is put to death for heresy because he hasn't, he's run into serious problems. But Doña Rosalinda is very much not your typical saint either. Here we have Saint Margaret popping out of the dragon, the patron saint of childbirth. Doña Rosalinda is someone who's very much interested in alchemy. She's interested in mysticism, and she becomes interested in finding the Grail because she understands that it's something more than has been told to Christians over time. I won't go into all the details of this story within the story, but I think one of the important things is to think about this as a possible link to Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who is known as the Mexican Phoenix. Now, this is a real woman who lived in Mexico, and she started her literary career. She was a lady-in-waiting to the Vicereina, Dona Eleanor del Carreto, and wrote more typical court poetry and drama that was very much for that setting, and then entered a convent and began writing, well, first she wrote a scathing letter against one of the church officials who wrote a scathing letter about the impossibility of trusting women to do anything. And she, again, in this kind of tradition that we're familiar with, is defending the right of women to be fully human beings. But I also think, I can't help but think that perhaps this particular and very famous image of her is the one that inspired the picture of the nun in the novel. Is she's winking, and Marion keeps staring at this picture going, why does that nun seem to be winking at me? And it's part of what unravels a lot of the strange events that happen after this, which I'll allude to, but I see I'm already running out of time. And it's probably not coincidental that Leonora Carrington was awarded the Sor Juana Medal in 2009. So a lot of what is bound up in the descriptions of this nun is very medieval in its depiction of her and what's in her library. The Musque de Madeleine, we had a conversation earlier about Mary Magdalene. This is part of the process where she uncovers the true use of the Grail. And of course, the Grail is an important part of this. I'm just speeding up because I'm noticing my time. The Grail isn't a very important part of it, but it's not the Grail as the receptacle of the blood of Christ. It's for the Grail as a receptacle of pneuma, the spirit. So this is the activating force which brings around various kinds of change and cauldrons. So it's a mystical union that happens, and this nun goes off to try to achieve that. She's aided in part of this by Taliesin, who shows up as this sort of wandering character who has knowledge, who seems to always appear everywhere at the right time, but he's also part of facilitating this process. Back in time, at the time of this nun, but also at the end of the novel, he shows up again as a postman. And this is in the wake of a climactic apocalypse. There's a lot I'm leaving out. But he also brings news that helps the women who are still left in the retirement home to grasp the idea that the grail is out there and he knows where it is, and they have to arrange going to get it. And again, the Book of Taliesin is part of setting up this medieval context for a character who is more than somebody who wrote these poems, that takes on this whole afterlife of his own. And hopefully I've at least whetted your appetite about this book, which is full of magic, full of strangeness, and full of really exciting elements, but that bring together these sort of alchemical processes in a way that leads to a satisfying book, and yeah, werewolves do, a satisfying book that is very timely because it deals with environmental apocalypse, but is also something that is full of incredible humor and great insight. And I'm pretty much out of time, so I will say thank you for sticking around for the last panel.